Apologies to everyone for our delays. I am quite certain it had nothing to do with surveillance, but rather our incompetence and challenges that we face trying to navigate technology. Welcome, everyone. Glad to have you here. Glad that you stuck around to listen to our webinar. This is in our series of Shuddhashar FreeVoice webinars that are related to our special issues. This particular webinar is connected to surveillance, the issue that was just published in November 1st. My name is Lisa Knight. I am editor and co-director of Shuddhashar FreeVoice. I am also professor of anthropology with a focus of South Asia, religion, and conditions of exile at Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina. The webinar today, it's entitled Surveillance, Protector and Perpetrator. And I'm incredibly honored to welcome our guests today. We have with us today Jan Fernbeck, and she is Associate Professor and Director of the Media Studies and Production Master's Program at Temple University. Her current work examines issues of privacy and surveillance online and in mobile technologies, the impact of information communication technologies on urban revitalization efforts, institutional uses of ICTs, ethics, and AI assistance, and the meaning of virtual community in contemporary culture. She has won several teaching awards, including the Lindback. She has also published a number of books, including Media Studies, Pedagogy and Practice, which is published by Routledge. And other articles and works of hers have been published in issues such as, or in venues such as New Media and Society, Information, Communication and Society, Communication Law and Policy, Journal of Communication Inquiry, Telematics and Informatics, Journal of Broadcasting and Electronic Media, Critical Discourse Studies, Communication, and on many other as well. And Helith Ravenholm is an independent anthropological consultant and researcher. Her area involves social and cultural behaviors on the consulting side, and she has a special interest in the nexus of tech, human rights, and crime, and more specifically, crime, criminalization, and criminality. So welcome to both of you. I'm glad to have you here. The articles that you both wrote, I will give just a very quick introduction to them, and then I'm excited to hear from you about your ideas and your work. So Jan, your article, it's entitled The Ethics of Surveillance and Identity Authentication. And you discuss this issue in the context of both government and higher education, focusing especially on issues of trust. And you point out intriguingly and importantly that these systems depend on our trust, or that we're expected to trust, and that we're expected to trust that the private information is stored securely and won't be misused. But you also point out how breaches can impact not just anybody, but also particular individuals, and that the surveillance systems in general can be biased. So these are some interesting ideas that I'm excited to get into. Helith, your article is entitled The Two Faces of Surveillance, Human Rights, Crime, and Criminalization. And you draw an interesting distinction between licit or legally allowed and illicit, not allowed surveillance. And you argue that licit surveillance isn't necessarily ethical, and then vice versa as well. Instead, the ethicality of surveillance depends heavily on context and positionality. So, with those as sort of my introductions, again, thank you and for being here, and welcome to everybody else who is present somewhere out there. I'm curious, as we start, what got you interested in this topic of surveillance? And I can say for myself, I have a very ambivalent feeling about surveillance. Maybe the issue, I think many of our issues that we publish are meant to be uncomfortable, but this is one that really makes me uncomfortable, right? I hate the idea of being watched. So what got you interested in this particular topic? Either one of you can start. Jan, would you like to start maybe?
Sure, I'll start. Thank you, Lisa. Hello, everybody. I wish I could remember exactly what got me interested in thinking about surveillance, but I've been studying privacy in a legal and ethical context for a long time. And I see the inextricable link between privacy and surveillance. Not all surveillance studies are done with under the mantle of privacy, but many of them are. And my particular interest is in that privacy kind of vein. So there's that dichotomy that gets set up between, having surveillance and having surveillance in ways that is useful for society, as we talked about in all of these articles, that licit types of surveillance are necessary and useful for things like stopping terrorism. But then on the other hand, the amount of governmental and in particular corporate surveillance that we undergo is massive, and largely not just unchecked, but unacknowledged and completely normalized. And for me, I'm much more interested in the corporate end of the surveillance problem, as I see it, because I think we just have no concept of just how much we are surveilled in the corporate realm. And so that there's like that hidden kind of power structure that has always fascinated me. So yeah, interested in privacy, human rights, and surveillance comes along with that for me.
Interesting. Yeah, you both touch on that issue of privacy, but also power. So I want to get into that too. Yeah, Helith, tell me, say something about how you got interested in this.
For me, it's actually a complicated route. It's an entire route. I actually started out as someone who was starting university late. I'm in my mid-40s now, and my interest was actually in cultural behaviors at that point, and especially in how cultures form myths, to be precise. And then I came upon a BA program that did not exactly cover that, but it gave me a brilliant physical aspect of it with archaeology and the more applied aspect with anthropology, and then I topped it up with a certification with anthropology later on, all of which ultimately do actually come into the surveillance. Then I started fieldwork independently, and I actually came upon people who were interested in anthropologists' opinion about what was happening within their situation, whatever the situation was. And through this reciprocity, because, ultimately it is about reciprocity when you're talking to people who are opening up and giving you information and then asking for something in return, even if it is just your opinion. Through the reciprocity, I started to realize that I could actually do something good with what I've learned. And that led to consulting, which ultimately led to consulting sometimes with businesses, and through businesses, obviously, very quickly, this touched on tech. And the more I was looking at tech, the more I was looking at human rights issues. And for me, especially minority issues, I'm of mixed background and I'm an LGBT plus member. So a lot of these issues, and obviously technology assisted surveillance is such a huge issue. These issues weren't they weren't abstract for me. They were something that I could see happening to myself, to someone like myself, to my friends. So one thing led to another, and here we are.
Interesting. Yeah, I think that a lot of the things that we get interested in and do work on have that sort of dimension of both the personal, right, and the sort of research curiosity, right? So it's that's an interesting story. Jan, I'm curious, I don't know, I never thought about exams being proctored by these surveillance systems. And I'm curious, does that happen, what you described in the article, does that happen at your university? And did that start during the pandemic?
It did start at my university, Temple University, during the pandemic. And I know that these systems were around pre-pandemic, but that they got really popular, obviously, during the pandemic. And they got super widespread, and some universities have even banned the use of these online proctoring systems. And others, like my university, have policies that say, you can use it in these more limited senses. Like, for example, at my university, an instructor can still use, we use Proctorio. An instructor can still use it, but they can't use it to scan the environment. So it still requires identity authentication, and it still allows for scanning of your behaviors as an individual. You just are not required as a student taking an online exam to show your entire environment like you can with these systems. And I happen to have been a department chair during the pandemic, and Temple University was just starting to think about using Proctorio, and I said, no, no, thank you, because of my work on surveillance. And the university still adopted it, but in my college, we pretty much don't use it. So at least I was able to to influence my college. But yeah, it's a system that many universities still rely on because of the popularity of these online classes. That students want them now; they're used to it, and the popularity of these courses has just skyrocketed. And so these exam proctoring softwares are still used quite often.
So maybe I'm missing something, but I'm thinking about, okay, great. So there's been a limit that's placed. So you're not being expected to show your environment. But how does that actually help? Because the kinds of examples you give focus really on the behavior and the bias that's implicit in the systems so the environment has something to do with, but not that much.
You're absolutely right, Lisa. I think the one reason why some universities, mine included, say that we're not going to scan the environment is more for an overall sort of privacy guarantee of some sort. Like during the pandemic, we saw how many students were taking classes in a closet or in their car, and at least the ability to not show a background, obscured those circumstances, environmental circumstances that students found themselves in. And so, not showing your environment is more of a sort of concession that, hey, look, we're not discriminating on you based on whether you're taking an exam in your car, for example. But in the end, you're absolutely right. Like it doesn't, the processes are still there to authenticate your identity, to understand who you are, to observe all of your behaviors, including the behaviors that, you exhibit as a person, physically, but also in terms of your keyboard interactions, because your computer behaviors are simultaneously monitored with these systems as well. So it's not just that your face is being monitored, but so is your computer. So yeah, or phone, as the case may be, because some students are, they don't have their cell only, so they don't use their computers. So yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I want to hear you get into that more. But when I think about it, I was like, when we moved to online during the pandemic, it's true. Suddenly we're in their living room or their bedroom, right? Or their closet or car, wherever it is that they are. And I remember the conversation that we had here was that we started to realize the different kinds of circumstances our students are coming from, right? And how, we could see that there were these challenges in their environment. And, they typically were a residential university. So usually people would live here, but to have that window into their environment humanized them, right? And gave us a depth of experience and connection. So I can see how in a surveillance thing, with a surveillance lens, you don't want that kind of information shared.
Yeah, exactly. And then when you think about the storage of the data and then how it gets used, I mean, Proctorio took away, most of my research is focused on Proctorio. There are lots of others, Honor Lock, Respondus. But Proctorio has taken away a whole bunch of dimensions of their website, which explained, they do have some very brief explanations of what they do with student data. And they say, we do not sell student data, but that's all it says. And you can get into an endless loop, because I've gotten into this endless loop several times on the Proctorio website, trying to find exactly what their policies are regarding security of data and privacy of individual student information. And it's almost impossible to find what their actual policies are, because they're just not, it keeps directing you to the same screen over and over again. And I'm thinking, okay, this is clearly problematic. And I thought, well, I'll look at the Securities and Exchange Commission information on Proctorio, but I can't, because they're not a publicly traded company, so I can't look up any SEC filings on them. So, it's sort of stuck. And we're sort of stuck, all of us are stuck, essentially trusting that, they will abide by their stated policy that they do not, that they store information only for, I think, 30 days or something like that. And then that they won't sell student information, but we, we don't know if that's actually how they operate.
Right. So even as a researcher, you're limited in what you can research.
Yeah. And it used to be during the pandemic, a couple of researchers, not myself, but some other researchers were able to speak. One researcher that I know of for sure was able to speak with some of these CEOs of some of these companies. And one of them said something, I'm not going to remember what it was, but it's something about, oh yeah, this is a trove of data that we're sitting on. It's amazing. And essentially, like, that was it, that sort of cut off the stream of potential interview subjects, that the interviewees, that, these corporate CEOs of Proctorio, et cetera, just stopped giving interviews. And who could blame them if they, if researchers are trying to sort of get at a gotcha moment for them. So, to make my research whole, it'd be great if one of them would sit down with me, but doesn't mean I won't try, but it's just not likely.
Right. Interesting. Helen, I'd love to hear sort of your thoughts on all this, because, you make this distinction between the licit and illicit. And clearly, Jan is talking about, something that's condoned, right? Through the corporate world. And
Definitely. And yeah, I love this discussion. I mean, it's just so good, because what I was thinking when I was listening right now was how quickly companies, I mean, fine, I have to say I am biased. I am biased because I have always worked from home. I always joke that I started work from home before it became popular. So I've used online, whatever was available online, because I had to start my own business, and that required me to actually operate as much as I could. It's cheaper to work online than actually travel, for instance, for you or for potential clients. And especially when you're new, you're going to have to make all sorts of shortcuts and actually say, oh, okay, fine, I'm going to do this, I'm available that way, it's easier. You have a lot of sleepless nights. So online was very useful. So that's definitely my bias, and keep it in mind. But on the other hand, I did see just how quickly during the pandemic it became normative to use not just technology that essentially connected you face to face. And to a certain extent during the pandemic, that was great because we really needed other humans. But at the same time, it became normal. And I see that a lot with the business, just trying to monitor what the people are doing. And what I keep telling people, and I've written on this on my LinkedIn, I've literally written a whole load of stuff on this, like, if you do not have the trust of your employers towards you, and the employer has to be a trust-based relationship. What are you hoping to see? What are you hoping to catch? I mean, just because they are working from home does not mean they're not doing more or less. If anything, most people do actually quite a lot more, because they feel guilty because they're not there. They're not at the office. We're all usually acclimated to well, I don't do work when I'm at home, so this isn't really work. And I have actually spoken to people who have literally developed anxiety about passing their work corner, because now it's a work corner. And I remember one woman talking about, she's got a very small apartment. It's like, I can't walk past that computer naked from the shower because I just feel that she's not being watched. It's basically that feeling of, well, I'm now at work. So, I mean, this is also something to consider. And of course, there are technologies being used, and connectivity has become far more aggressively present in our life. And very often I see companies just trying to apply some kind of surveillance because they're being told this is a product you can use. And very often the people who are producing it put down disclaimers. This is not about, oh, well, you shouldn't be using it this way or that way. It's more a disclaimer of, oh, we're not responsible if someone's doing whatever they're doing with it, because you could spy on someone this way. You can invade someone's privacy. And this ends up with people who are basically more and more anxious. When they're anxious, they make more mistakes. What does that mean? That their boss is now saying, well, if you're working hybrid, you're making more mistakes. Yes, because you are standing there essentially like a little ghost in front of them, usually during the camera moments or whatever. And you're actually trying to monitor what they're doing. You're entering their space like you were standing there when they're at the office constantly, which doesn't happen the same way. And I think that's actually the most important thing. There are some laws. I know that EU has actually started putting in laws about, you are allowed to disconnect. You can't just constantly be present. Nobody can expect that. But again, this had to pass relatively quickly. Are we passing these laws quickly enough? That's something that actually really, really bothers me. When it comes to licitness, I always tell people, just because it's licit, it doesn't mean that it's human rights building. It doesn't matter if this is about a product or something that a government is doing or anything else. We need to know why we're using it, how we're using it, and whether or not we're actually human rights breaking with it. So I think that's my 2 cents on this.
Yeah, if I might add one quick statement to that, I always tell my students that, your own sense of morality will not let you get away with near as much as the law lets you get away with. And you just illustrated that in your comments. Yeah.
That's definitely true.
Thinking about the psychological implications of all of that too. Would either of you want to sort of touch on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm not a psychology researcher, but I can say that because as it pertains to surveillance and trust in particular, there's an awful lot of fear and mistrust that are engendered among, people who are heavily surveilled, whether it's through this online proctoring system or through other types of, I also wrote a little bit about government benefits receipt and those technological systems that are required to enter into those systems, enter into the benefits administration systems. That when you have that sort of heavy specter of being surveilled, you alter your behavior in many ways. There's so many psychological studies that have been done about how people alter their behaviors when they're being watched. And, all about that as anthropologists, that people change their behaviors when they are being observed. And, that oftentimes results in, some mental health issues, in particular among students. But also just those feelings of powerlessness, of disconnection from the overall system. So if you're applying for government benefits and you feel utterly oppressed by the surveillance, then you sort of feel disconnected from your own well-being in many ways. Like, look at the hoops I have to jump through just to be able to get SNAP benefits, and then from the perspective of the online proctoring that I wrote about, that can cause students to just have a lack of faith in the educational system in general. So, oh, my university isn't even, like, my university doesn't trust me enough to not monitor my keyboard and my face. But they might be storing this information. I don't know what's going to happen to it. I don't know that I can trust. My university doesn't trust me. I'm not sure I trust my university. And so this whole snowball effect happens with you know, fear and manipulation, and yeah, it results in a lack of confidence in institutions, which I think is a serious problem right now in many societies.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think I'd add to this, if I may. There is also the impact on minorities, especially minorities that are actually criminalized or come from environments where they have been criminalized. Because it's hard, it's actually really, really hard to shake that feeling of, even if you are now safe objectively as much as you can be, because we know that hate crime, for instance, is up. I know that. It is hard to actually sort of shake this feeling of, well, what ifs, right? The what ifs happens if I can only be openly myself in this environment, this my environment, and now suddenly everybody's in it, right? So what happens? And from what I've been looking at, obviously I don't have all the data because there's so much data and it's very hard to get to the data, especially where people have to be secretive. When I was looking at my research for minorities and on the question of deviance, right? It just became so clear how much technology enabled people who were being criminalized, so the top-down criminalization, basically how much it actually enabled the people who were doing the criminalization to actually take a peek into someone's privacy. And that is terrifying as a thought. That is terrifying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, it is terrifying. Jan, I'd love for you to give some more texture to some of the examples that you wrote about. And I mean, you gave so many, you gave examples about using the technology, you know, in the proctoring context and the ways in which, like, I'm just talking about sort of human rights and bias of the systems. Can you give something for the people who haven't read your article yet? Could you explain like how these systems make mistakes and are biased as systems and that work against certain particular groups?
Yeah, so these systems can make mistakes based on a number of different sort of variables, I guess. So they can make mistakes based on people's appearance, you know, so these are all documented cases where neuroatypical individuals who might, you know, move more or move their gaze or have an inconsistent gaze, for example, they get flagged for cheating behaviors, so-called cheating behaviors. That can also happen when people have darker skin and the technology does not recognize their faces. That's been really well documented. Also, there are students who have, you know, wearing hijabs or other religious garments have been flagged as having an atypical appearance, which then, you know, flags them. And then one of the students I interviewed said he tends to look at his hands a lot and that he got kicked out of an exam because he was looking at his hands. And I just kept thinking, like, who doesn't do that? I mean, you know, yeah, we can type, but do you know where all the numbers are? You know, like just little things. Like, what if you're taking a math exam and you need to look down to be able to, you know, get the calculator on your, it just seems crazy to me. So these are all the types of, these are behaviors that can get you flagged. And when you get flagged, you might get kicked out of an exam, in which case, usually there's some kind of human intervention, and it's oftentimes the instructor. So the instructor can say, no, that's fine. And then the person is permitted to hopefully pick up the exam later. So these are just some basic ways that the technology operates and can, you know, ultimately harm the students just from an exam perspective. So then, you know, on the structural level, targeting groups of, you know, targeting certain groups results in missed opportunities for those individuals, right? So, you know, they may be branded in specific ways. They might, if they are thrown out of an exam, for example, like that obviously can impact their grade, but they might not be able to get back into an exam. They're just these little things that ultimately add up in things like missed opportunities. And that then that feeds back into these structures of dominance that we see by, privileged populations. Also on the structural level, it feeds these sort of negative cultural attitudes about the targeted populations. Oh, well, why is that person wearing a hijab anyway? They must be in some way atypical and strange, and so therefore they don't deserve the kinds of opportunities that privileged populations deserve. And then, of course, on an individual level, being flagged as a potential cheater impacts a student's reputation, which then again not only works against opportunities for such students, but then may also result in some mental health concerns, which we briefly touched on a few minutes ago. So that targeting then ultimately sows the seeds of mistrust on so many levels, including, in the institutions, educational institutions themselves. So, these are just a couple of ways, that we see that this type of oppressive sort of bias that results in, that results ultimately in students being harmed. These are just some of the harms. There are more.
There are more. Yeah. I mean, I complain, I'll say, carry my phone around with me and I say, well, somebody might say you're being listened to or you're being watched. It's like, I have nothing to hide, right? It's okay, but I also recognize, that, I don't really have anything to hide, at least most of the time. But
You do though, because privacy, I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you.
Go
Lisa,
ahead.
Don't mind.
You're gonna
Because
make me more nervous, aren't you?
yeah, that's a very common argument, the nothing to hide argument, right? But privacy, so if I'm contrasting privacy and surveillance, so privacy is not about hiding at all. Privacy is about retaining your own dignity, and being able to control information about yourself, being in control of your own self. And so that whole nothing to hide argument sort of ignores the fact that we all have things to, quote, hide, but that has nothing to do with our sense of individual dignity. So the things I always tell my students, like, well, if you have nothing to hide, then next class, I want you to come in with all your credit card statements, and we're going to look at all of them. And I want to see all your social media, so we're going to project it on screen. Oh, and by the way, don't wear clothes either. So, we all have something to hide, right? And we get to choose what face we put forward, right? We interact with individuals in our homes differently than if we're not working in our homes. We interact with, our families and at home differently than we do in a workplace or in a public space, and so we get to choose that identity that we project in those different circumstances. And so when you think about this level of surveillance that we're talking about here, that boundary is breached, that we are not in control of our own information. We are not in control, essentially, of aspects of our own identities. So yeah, sorry to interrupt you, Lisa.
No. I mean, thanks.
I'm
Now
just
I'm going to be more
presenting an
paranoid.
example right now, literally moving the cat blanket away from the radiator because it was too hot.
Oh, that's funny. Well, Helen, this ties really nicely into some of the things you were saying about privacy and private space. I'm curious to hear sort of your reflections on the surveillance and human rights and privacy.
Well, to start with, what did I just do? And I am looking back because some of the cats are in the bedroom and they went out. And now I'm considering, should I get up? Should I not get up? Should I let them out? Should I not let them out? Because if I do, we'll become covered in cats. I mean, I'm just saying that because I'm not being cruel, but they will seriously be all over the place. And again, this is something that we have to consider when we are actually dealing with our realities. What are we? I think that the point of surveillance should be, like Jan, to paraphrase really, because Jan's already said it, it's about how much we are happy to actually consent to. And the part of the problem that I see with that is informed consent. It has to be an informed consent. And most people, me included, do not have enough knowledge about technology. We go through all these lengthy disclaimers that basically say, sign here. And oh, by the way, you will not understand everything that you just read. And probably we don't most of the time, but you are agreeing to it. Also, there may be changes. Are we agreeing to all the changes? When it comes to top down, the governments, for instance, okay, maybe right now it's okay to be LGBT and walk on the street with hand in hand with your spouse. What happens when you're criminalized? Because this can happen overnight. This can happen overnight. And we've seen that in certain spaces right now where on one hand, we've got LGBT rights making advances. On the other, we are seeing some rapid retractions of LGBT rights. So what happens there? I always consider that when I'm walking down the street with my wife. It's like right now, I am privileged enough to be able to do this. There are people who can't. And the surveillance possibilities, whether they are by someone who has actually signed into law, oh, okay, fine, we're going to have street cameras. And don't get me wrong, street cameras are great. They can be used in looking for people who have wandered off, looking for people who have been kidnapped and so forth. They have been used that way. Other technology has been used that way. But at the same time, how have we agreed to just that, or have we agreed to more? And can we still have the right to say, is this a situation in which we actually have the right to say, hey, I'm agreeing to this, but I'm not agreeing to that. So that's something else. And one thing, for instance, with business, I know that I am going to say this. I read an article, this was during COVID. It was, I think, Forbes, might have been Forbes, when someone wrote essentially about what your workspace now should look like, and essentially described the type of house I would love to have, because more cat space. But at the same time, most of us do not have. Most of us do not live in a wonderful big space where essentially we can just have an entire room devoted just to our hybrid conferencing. We do not have that. So when we are looking at what we are agreeing to, we have to ask ourselves, how will agreeing to this type of technology influence what people think we should be agreeing to as well? So that's one thing that I always consider, and I really, really try to bring into my consulting and in my writing. So that's something.
Yeah, and it's true. We didn't have an opportunity to agree to any of this, did we? I mean, it's
That's right. There's that trust. There's that trust aspect again, right? That you're right. We had no opportunity to agree. It was like, well, you're taking this class, so you have to be monitored. You are using this social media, so you have to agree to these policies. I mean, this is how so much technology that governs our lives. Even things like using your IP address, so your university or whoever gives you an email, your service providers has a giant long list of things that you agree to, otherwise you can't use the service. And I mean, this is the way our lives go now, and there's this resignation. People just sort of feel like, okay, I know I'm being surveilled, I just don't know what to do about it. I feel utterly overwhelmed, and I need to move on with my life. So I'm just not going to worry about it. And then they're unaware. It's not their fault. They're unaware of the myriad ways that they can be harmed, including things like, disproportionate opportunities in the marketplace. So, like if you are a frequent flyer and you give up a whole bunch of information about yourself and you have good credit, you might get all these heavy discounts that are not available to other people. And we all know, like, you're going to pay higher insurance premiums, you're going to pay more for your car loan, all of that, based on the nature of your credit and the nature of how much you're surveilled. And so, if there are some insurance companies, for example, have gone so far as to monitor somebody's social media contacts. And if they are associated with people who have been, for example, imprisoned or, you know, are on government benefits or something like that. Like those are quote undesirable individuals. And if you associate with undesirable individuals, then you must be a bad risk yourself. So, you know, therefore, we're going to charge you more for your insurance premiums. We're going to charge you more for your car loan, et cetera. So, yeah.
Mhm.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it sounds like you're saying that the system itself is just the overall structural system is a problem and not necessarily.
Well, I would actually argue that both the technology itself and the broader system are implicated in this bias. So, you know, technological systems are often programmed in ways that ignore human needs, that aren't about human dignity, that don't empathize with actual humans. They operate through codes, right? So, and these codes are opaque to us. They're often incomplete. They might be difficult to decipher, or they're not true to human experiences. You know, that idea of like, there's a bunch of research on gaze, you know, and so most people, when they're thinking, they might look up, you know, but that gets flagged as a wrong behavior in online proctoring. And so that's an example of like technology being coded in a way that's not true to human experience. And then like the broader systems of things like benefits administration, for example, contain cultural biases that are replicated within those systems themselves. Like people who need help are a drain on productive society, and they usually come from groups that are already targeted for bias. And so that there's that context of suspicion again. And so that results in more fear and mistrust. And so we just keep having this sort of, you know, vicious circle that keeps happening. So I would say that both the technology and the broader system are implicated in the continued biases that we see.
A parallel that comes to my mind is medicine, right? Where, you know, we have this whole medical system that has its own problems. And a lot of the medication that has been developed has been tested only on certain groups of people, right? And so we only
Yes.
know, you know,
Yes.
that the norm, which is white and male and of a certain, you know, stature and background, they're the ones who are going to benefit. Well, we just know that because those are the ones who've been tested by and large, right? And so any other sort of diversity in terms of body shape or size or gender or background, et cetera, you know, it's who knows if the medication or treatments will work in the same way. So it sounds a little bit like a similar kind of
Yeah.
structural issue.
It absolutely is. I mean, you're totally right. And there's, you know, there's research in that vein too. It's one that I'm less familiar with that type of research, but you're absolutely right about that. And that whole systemic, you know, the systemic bias that we see just keeps, as we were saying earlier, being maintained. And I have small rays of hope occasionally because I see in the medical community, for example, like some researchers acknowledging like, hey, we really ought to, you know, stop relying on, you know, just white men for the most part to test this, you know, anti-ulcer medication, like, you know, because women get ulcers too, you know, so that there's at least some rays of hope in the medical community, but you know, it has a long way to go. And yeah.
So in the technological realm, will AI help these things or make it worse?
For me, I can see it both, right? So, sorry, I don't mean to sound, you know, like I'm equivocating because I think that, you know, in many respects, AI is useful in, you know, sort of streamlining certain aspects of certain, you know, administrative technologies, right? So AI can really streamline things, and that can be good. And I think there are some some programmers, computer technologists who are interested in AI as a replacement for a human bias. And that's where I'm feeling like, no, that should be the other way around. Like, we want to rely on humans to check the biases that are inherent in the computing and technological codes, so there's sort of a both and thing happening here, I think, with AI. So I'm thinking about it specifically in terms of bias, but absolutely, I see like some efficiencies being created through the implementation of AI, but at the same time, there are also some problems created as well, and it can amplify some of the biases that we've been seeing already.
Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, interesting. So I want to hear about sort of your suggestions for solutions going forward. But before I get there, I held it. You wrote quite a bit about popular culture, and I think it's so interesting to see how advanced a lot of the sci-fi from the early days were in terms of thinking about these kinds of things. Of course, Orwell's 1984. I feel like we live in it in many ways. But other
I
things
hope
too.
not.
No, hopefully not. I know. No, of course not. But I mean, just the glimmers, right? I mean, how long ago was that written? And yet so I'd just love to hear sort of your thoughts, because you think about surveillance more than I want to. But do you think that we have those kinds of things in popular culture have they helped us get to where we are now? Have they primed us so that we are more comfortable with these ideas of being watched? Or was this like sort of a part of the creative, generative human imagination that found outlets in popular culture and in real life? Or I don't know, just what do you think?
Where to start? So firstly, I love looking at pop culture because it is such a mirror of who we are. I absolutely agree with you. There is so much accuracy there. My wife, especially, for instance, is a huge fan of Star Trek. So I got to rewatch a lot of it just recently, which is definitely impacting me. I know that. So on that note, possibly the deepest point for me, as we're talking about AI, right, was made in, there's this one episode in Next Generation where Data's personhood is discussed, whether or not he's a life form or just an object. And obviously, with the discussions on AI, we are definitely having those discussions, and we're also, in a way, returning to them because personhood historically is not or was not a given. Maybe I should be saying equal personhood rather than personhood in general. But so basically, there is definitely this feeling of technology is definitely present, and it's making us think about ourselves. As for shaping the narratives, I do think it's a chicken and egg situation, because a lot of the tech presented in the science fiction is essentially the tech that makes life easier for us. So it's something that we're going to think about. Wait, how would that look if we could do XYZ? And then someone else is watching this and saying, huh, actually, we could do it this and this and this way. And some of it is elaboration from technology or even war technology that exists around us in a specific time, in books, in series. It draws on fears and very real concerns that arise or arose historically from observations of how technology of any kind is used in action. And obviously also societies have also always watched. I mean, to a certain extent, everybody watches. We all watch because evolutionarily speaking, watching your environment for things that may actually jump out and eat us is basically how we survive. But I think it's also with societies, with human societies, we definitely see, and I would love to see a primatologist discuss this because I'm curious what they'd actually say, but with human societies, for instance, we definitely look for otherness, and otherness can actually make it very, very complicated to see real danger versus imagined danger. And this is where criminalization comes in. What is actually a crime? Is crime something that I am doing that is actually harming you in some real way, some tangible way, or is this something that we have agreed as a group is a problem for us? So obviously, when it comes to how, for instance, technology has evolved. I know I've heard one documentary many years back claim that Star Trek technology, for instance, specifically, and Star Wars technologies have actually been used by engineers who had watched them as children and then actually started working on them. I would definitely say that these stories do inspire people to be more watchful sometimes, but also when we see technology and how great or otherwise it could be, I think it can also become what if I borrow from Gertz, who talks about oral factuality, right? The feeling of, well, this is the truth that we accept as a society, as a group. I think technology and surveillance with it has become our oral factuality, and seeing it in stories has become our oral factuality. Now, that doesn't mean that this just means the bad sides. Also, the good sides have become the oral factuality. We rely on technology for solving crimes. We rely on technology for medical services. We rely on technology for a lot of stuff, but we also fear technology in scenarios that we have actually seen. So for me, I love pop culture because it literally tells us all about ourselves, what we are afraid of ourselves doing to ourselves. So,
Yeah.
I hope that answers the question.
Yes, no, absolutely. No, I'm gonna go and go back to Star Trek because I think hearing you say that that sort of gave like a blueprint for some of the directions that we've taken. I can, yeah, I can see that. Just really interesting. I think
Well, when
myths
we
in
watch,
general. Hmm? Sorry?
so go ahead.
No, I
I was
think
going to say, when we watch, we very much stop and we just literally dissect anthropologically.
oh, hilarious. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's like myth making, right? You create
Yeah.
these myths about what the universe is supposed to look like, and then it's can also be self-fulfilling. So interesting. So okay, so a lot of this has been rather depressing, although the the venture into popular culture is a little bit at least it's fun. But what should we do? What do we do next? What what do you tell your students, Jan, and or hell, what do you tell your clients who are struggling with issues related to any of this?
Does Jan want to start?
Sure, I'll start. Yeah, I think, from a larger perspective, there are groups, you mentioned earlier about, new regulations in the EU, so there are legislators, coming together, even technologists coming together to try to make systems more auditable and, more fair, so that, third parties can look at these systems and say, hey, wait, there's something a little bit problematic here. So on that, really large sort of governmental intervention and regulatorily intervening environments, there's conversation at least happening. And then more on the ground, I think, for me, one of the things that I like to do is, first off, be completely transparent with students about these issues and about the technology and what it can do and what it might not be able to do. The other thing is, like, thinking about this from a university perspective, if universities are implementing these online proctoring technologies, like, the whole point of the university is, to develop the intellectual, social, economic potential of students, while they also engage with the larger community. And so that means, in many ways, like, valuing what some people call an ethic of care. And that means focusing on student well-being, respecting student autonomy and freedom. And in a presentation I recently gave on this, I said one way to judge whether a practice violates an ethic of care for students is to decide whether you would agree to be subjected to the same requirement as a condition for doing your work. So, that places you in a situation of empathy. And then that ethic of care would then say that students are going to learn better when they're not anxious or coerced or overly surveilled or subjected to bias and discrimination. It enhances trust. And then some other solutions include things like, maybe from an ethical perspective, higher education institutions could be considered data fiduciaries. So like they would have to act in the best interests of students when collecting and using student data. So that's one thing. Even like if universities are going to continue to collect data on students, because even though universities are using these online proctoring systems, the universities are given access to the student data. Well, and universities are given access to student data in all kinds of other surveilling contexts, like grade learning management systems and things like that. So universities could use these data collection points to maybe improve students' academic experience. So like it could monitor, if you're going to monitor student data anyway, maybe you could use that data to identify struggling students and direct them to resources. Or even like outline, learning management systems could outline learning habits and help instructors create more useful assignments and exams. So the whole thing here is, to try to think about that ethic of care, think about transparency, think about what the role of university instruction is. And is it about like trying to flag people for cheating, or is it about, thinking about developing the student in ways that are going to enhance their opportunities moving forward? So yeah, I know I just said a lot.
No, that's so good. That's so good. It gives me hope, but I can see, you're talking about students, but it's applicable everywhere, right? I mean, it's not just
Yes.
about, that ethics of care and trying to, if we have these systems, can we use them to improve the opportunities for dignity, for human dignity, right? Helen,
Yeah.
can you add
I
to this?
think we can. I want to add, there's so much that John has said so perfectly that there's not a lot to add really, but I think we can. I think we really can improve how people are being taken care of, because the thing about technology is, to be honest, about any product, is it should actually serve a purpose. It shouldn't be some kind of a ruling power over us. It should actually serve a purpose. And I really do see a lot of use in technology. I mean, for example, from my own perspective, I'm an avid cyclist and jogger. And I know that I will actually, when my wife doesn't feel like going out, I will actually use technology for her to track where I am and to know that I'm safe. But again, that's informed consent. That is informed consent. And I think we can do that with businesses as well. We can do that. I very often tell people, what you're actually focusing on is, almost all people who actually try to use things in a punitive way focus on failures. Whether or not this is, you didn't finish a project, or you didn't write your essay on your own, whether or not that's true, or whatever. But basically, you're not asking yourself why. Why did this happen? What happened in this person's life right now? Is there something wrong? Are they dealing with a mental health issue? Are they dealing with an abusive spouse, for instance? This is something that did actually pop up a lot with people who then sometimes had a dilemma. And again, this is a privacy thing. When they noticed, because of hybrid work, that someone is actually in abusive relationships, like, what do you do there? Do you actually look the other way, quite literally? Or do you actually do something about it? And I always tell people, do something, say something. This isn't, privacy is great. I value privacy for so many reasons, but it should not enable. There should be no enabling, whatever that enabling means. There should be no enabling of violation of someone's rights when you're actually not looking at them, when, like, their spouse is in the background screaming at them, or for that matter, for a group, top down, be that a boss or a state themselves. It shouldn't be about basically just pressuring and breaking those human rights. So in a way, I suppose, to summarize, we need to return to the situation where human rights are sacred to us and where they apply to everybody.
Great, great. Well, I think that is a perfect note on which we should conclude this conversation. At least we've ended with some hopeful thoughts for moving forward. And so we've come to the end of our time as well. And I want to thank both of you so much for taking this time, for being patient at the beginning as we were trying to figure out the technology. But for sharing your expertise, your ideas, your thoughtfulness, your care with the people that you work with and with the larger community. It really comes out in what you have been talking about. And of course, for those who are watching, I want to encourage everybody to read the articles that were written. We've touched on little aspects of it, but there's a lot more that's there as well. And also to make sure that our viewers, please also look at the other articles that are in the issue. There's a nice variety of different topics looking at examples from different parts of the world. So we have articles that look at situations in the US, India, China, Bangladesh, Nepal, Eritrea, Greece, Iran, right? So lots of diversity in terms of examples, some of them from personal experience, firsthand experiences. And then also different ways. We've been talking a lot about digital and institutional kinds of surveillance, but there's also the human surveillance, of neighbors looking at neighbors, and, so that realm of societal surveillance. So lots of things, I think, to think about and to ponder. And if any of this makes, I don't know, you all feel troubled, I think that we've done a good job of raising some issues and some thought-provoking ideas. So thank you both. I really appreciate this time, and I will.
Thank you for having us and for putting
Yeah,
up
you're
with
welcome.
students.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it was fun. I enjoyed it, and grateful to be able to participate with you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.